To our research seminar series. So we are sort of having research talks every week. And this week we have with us Professor Jack Chu. So I'm Rennie Hong from the Communication and New Media Department, and Jack is my colleague, an esteemed colleague of mine. Jack is the president of Chinese Communication Association and elected fellow of the International Communication Association, ICA, as well as a recipient of the C. Edwin Baker Award for the Advancement of Scholarship on Media, Markets, and Democracy. Jack is a renowned scholar. He has published over 100 research articles and 10 books in both English and Chinese, including Goodbye I Slave, a manifesto for digital evolution in the University of Illinois Press, 2016, World Factory in the Information Age at Guangxi Normal University Press, 2013, and Working Class Network Society at MIT Press, 2009. The title of his talk today is Radical Praxis of Computing in the PRC, Forgotten Stories from the Maoist to Post-Maoist Era. I read the article and it's a very exciting article. So Jack, I think we will have a great talk ahead. So without further ado, may I allow Jack to start his presentation.
Thank you very much, Renyi. Thanks everyone for coming. Welcome to this launch. Okay, usually our research talks are scheduled at lunchtime. Okay, so that you can have some additional intellectual food for thought. Okay? And so on this first slide you will see a QR code. I think Renyi said he will also drop the link to this article. This article was just published online a couple of weeks ago, right, from the journal Internet Histories. This was a special issue on Asian Internet histories, edited by my colleagues, Professors Gerard Gorgin and Hai-Qin Yu, right? And they invited me to, and also Hongzhe. Hongzhe is my former PhD student, but now associate professor in Peking University. Okay, this was actually started, this project was started from his dissertation work about a decade ago, right? And but then his dissertation was in Chinese. Okay, that was when I was at the Chinese University of Hong Kong, and I keep saying to him like, you need to translate your Chinese stuff into English, but then he's too busy. Okay, he did many other things, excellent things. Some of this work also went on to win, academic awards within China. Okay, and he also translated other things. One of them we will see today from English to Chinese. But then so as the first author of this article published in Internet Histories, I translated a lot of what he wrote in Chinese already, but adding something new, which is the radical praxis part. Okay, especially this article by Mao Zedong on practice, 实践论. So that's something new, building on top of his dissertation, Chinese language dissertation. So the questions we try to address in this article, okay, is more written for media and communication scholars rather than for real historians or real Maoists, which I am neither myself, right? And so the question we have are, first, how to understand China's history of computing from an emic perspective. Emic, this is emic versus ethic. Okay, this is from anthropology. Emic means, how the Chinese see themselves, right? Ethic means how other people would come and see in this particular group, the Chinese, and interpret from American perspective, for example. So that's called ethic. Okay, there are lots of ethic interpretation about how China's, can rise up as an IT powerhouse, globally speaking. Okay, but there's not enough emic, okay, the kind of internal perspective, okay, especially from within the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP, okay? And also how the policymakers, the Chinese policymakers, and also members of the domestic computer industry, how do they see, their practice? How do they theorize about their practice by themselves? All right. So usually the ethic perspective, from an outsider perspective, they tend to truncate, right? Because China has a relatively, closed door period, okay, before the open door period. So there's a big truncation, usually using 1978. Okay, that's the beginning of the opening up open door policy in post-Mao China. Okay, so that truncates, okay, the Maoist era and the post-Mao era, right? And but here in this article, we try to explore and also demonstrate the continuity, okay, above and beyond this kind of truncation, right? And in addition to describing and showing the historical evidence that we have accumulated over nearly a decade, okay, and some of these documents, were collected by Hongzhe during his PhD research and also afterwards from archival centers in Beijing, for example. Some of them we bought online. I would show some of this here. There are actually lots of documents that could be bought online now, okay, without traveling to archive centers in China. Sitting in Singapore, I can order these things online and read them, okay, and then take notes from them. And finally, the archival source. Okay, I was so nicely surprised when I find out NUS, the Chinese library of NUS, actually have lots of, okay, this is one of the definitive, okay, archival center published in 1984, okay, by the Ministry of Electronics Industry in China at the time, okay, when Jiang Zemin was the minister of electronics industry, okay, very, very rich. And we can, so right next to CNM department, we can go and get these materials quite easily, okay, so that's making use of the archival resources even within Singapore. So, so after going through these materials, which I'm going to show some of them to you, all right, especially highlighting the forgotten parts. Okay, the history is always, if you read George Orwell, right, is actually a product of by the powers that be in the present, right? So there are some histories being remembered, celebrated, but then our analysis here actually emphasize the forgotten part, okay, and we will try to understand, okay, what lessons can we draw, right, from this historical revisiting of the forgotten stories, so that we can learn something new to inform a new analysis of Chinese computing histories and Asian internet histories, okay, in the plural. Okay, so that's something we will, because again, this special issue is called Asian internet histories. So this is the prevailing assumptions that we are going to attack. Not all of them are wrong, but we think they are very selective. Okay, they are very problematic, being presenting only a partial, okay, and create the kind of oblivion, okay, that we try to overcome through this exercise. So I already addressed some of these, mentioned some of this here, is to say, all right, the assumption is that, okay, computing in China started, with Deng Xiaoping, the post-Mao leader, standing in front of an Apple II computer imported, okay, from China to from the US to China, and the guy who brings this to China, he actually is a famous guru, and Ren Yi mentioned his name in his research talk a few months ago. His name is Alvin Toffler. Alvin Toffler actually traveled to China from Japan, carrying a personal computer with him, from the US, okay, and many Americans see that, and even Chinese today see that as the beginning, but that is actually wrong, right? That is only the beginning of post-Mao era. We call it post-socialist or neoliberal term in Chinese computing. But then the roots actually go much further behind, right? And another common, okay, assumption is that China basically borrowed everything, from Soviet Union or from the US, all right? or copycat, okay, stealing, Donald Trump, right, saying China is stealing from us, all right, and in the beginning, when China normalized relationship with the U.S., when American computer scientists visit China, in the 1970s, the Americans often mentioned to each other, think they suspect these are actually something that the Chinese have stolen from the Soviets. Okay, so that's also, there's nothing new from what Trump has been saying, right? And then no matter we say it's boring, stolen, stealing from the USSR, the Soviet Union, or from the US, is to say there's a linear predetermined process, right? It's either for good or for bad. Okay, especially now in Western media, right? The dominant narrative about technology, in China is about, okay, it's the so-called Black Mirror, right? China is the ultimate Black Mirror of surveillance, of social control. It's a stereotype, right? And once you have this kind of, oversimplified ethic, okay, explanations that we see, it's very easy to, to use these kind of ethic explanations to fit the current, Black Mirror stereotype of today. So history, again, even in Western media, is used to serve the present. Okay, it's not just something communists do. Okay, other powers also do the same, right? But this partial, okay, perspectives, this is what we try to show today. They do not hold up to empirical and historical evidence that I'm going to share today. So this is our emic approach. Okay, we're going to show the continuity from Maoist to post-Mao era, even today. We're going to show there are multiple roots of indigenous technology, right? So the roots for computing is actually very deep. They are much longer and have more direct implications for China's digital industries today than previously recognized. And number 3 point is that to say we are trying to show the underdetermined trajectory. Nobody can predict. I don't think Mao could predict himself, okay, about the ways of development, okay, the trajectories, changing directions, okay, contingent upon external, okay, geopolitical, influence, and also internal crisis within the PRC, the People's Republic of China. And with this, I'd like to also admit that I am not a Maoist myself, all right? And what we are doing here is using one essay of Mao as a theoretical framework to try to make sense of the historical trajectories for China's computing industry, okay? And I am not here today, okay? I know because we have to talk in the context of 2021, and there are lots of Xi Jinping, okay, followers also rediscovering Mao to justify today's theory. This is not what I'm doing, right? On the very contrary, okay, I would like to invite people to read this article, have this Maoist radical praxis as applied to the sectorial analysis of computing. And this kind of radical praxis can be used as a way to assess, to criticize China's state capitalist development model today. So following Linchuan Pang, okay, my good colleague, okay, from Chinese University of Hong Kong, okay, when she analyzed Maoism, okay, and she does many excellent, okay, analysis of Maoist, for example, barefoot doctors, okay, and so I'm following Pang Linchuan in seeing Maoism as a textual site. Okay, it's a site of historical text, much more than a coherent set of philosophies. Okay, because Mao developed a richer historical view, which can help the PRC to reflect on its relationship to the future. Right, we need to reflect, okay, on PRC's. It's not predetermined. Okay, and also because, okay, we need to treat Maoism as a resource, as a textual resource, okay, because it was not uncommon, okay, when I read the, just I show some of the physical all right, archives we are using for this article, but there are many more online. Okay, if we read the memoirs from Chinese computer scientists, okay, during the Maoist era, many of them retired. Okay, they write their memoirs, okay, or their children are writing memoirs for them. They often insist on attributing their past accomplishments to Mao Zedong thought, okay, and especially on this particular article on practice. So you see, this is on practice when it was published in the 1940s on the left-hand side. And I used the diagram to show essentially what it's about. Okay, practice and knowledge, all right, on the right-hand side. All right, so there's knowledge is here, all right. And then the blue part, okay, so before this point, of course, we know Chinese Communist Party was started under the direct influence of the Soviet Communist Party, right? So Leninism, Marxism, Leninism, especially Stalinism. When Mao was writing this in 1937, this was the heyday of Stalinism. Okay, that emphasized, okay, we need to use the orthodoxy of Marxism, Leninism, that's the knowledge, to guide the practice. Okay, for example, in China. Okay, and then this practice, you know, would produce knowledge, okay, in this circle, right? But what Mao actually is building on the practice and the knowledge related to say, knowledge actually needs to serve practice, and practice can be used to uncover and test and develop, okay, knowledge. In this sense, okay, this was very radical, okay, for communist, okay, movement in the 1930s, okay, is because this directly, okay, challenged Stalin's, okay, orthodoxy at the time, right? So this is usually the full model is usually called Maoist dialectic materialism of knowing and doing, okay, between practice and knowledge. So Mao's main contention, okay, in this legendary article, you can easily find English version of this article, right? This is the main contention, is that if the knowledge of revolutionaries does not change rapidly in accordance with the changed situation, they will be unable to lead the revolution to victory. Practice, I'm quoting directly, okay, from this essay, Mao's essay. Practice knowledge, again practice, and again knowledge. This form repeats itself in endless cycles, and with each cycle, the content of practice and knowledge rises to a higher level. Such is the whole of the dialectical materialistic theory of knowledge, and such is the dialectic materialist theory of the unity of knowledge and doing. So in order to make sense, okay, about why this is a radical, okay, practice, we need to know, okay, Mao wrote this article 2 years after the Long March. Mao himself could have been killed, okay, so this is where the first Chinese Soviet Republic was established in southern Jiangxi, and they were militarily defeated, so they had to retreat, okay. You know, in the first part of this Long March, Mao was an underdog, okay, within the party. Okay, but then in Zunyi, after a meeting here, okay, he became the military leader, right? And then they went up to Yan'an. So this is where he was writing this essay 2 years after. But Mao was still facing very strong internal competition from members of the Comintern. Okay, we also call it the Third Communist International. Okay, that was basically Stalin's organization to control world revolution. And then there are some Chinese members in it, okay, such as Wang and also Bogu. Okay, they were trained in Moscow, and now they're sent to China to lead the revolution. And they see themselves as, you know, having more legitimacy than Mao. Mao has never studied in the Soviet Union. Okay, and the Comintern, okay, never trusted Mao fully from, you know, the archives, right? So Mao had to struggle. Okay, and by the way, the reason that the Red Army of China went to this place is because it's closer to the Soviet Union. All right, and there are actually other branches that they tried to go to Soviet in this union, and they were annihilated. Right, so Mao was writing this in an essay in a way as a political tool and also ideological tool to justify, okay, his leadership in China. Okay, so that Stalinism has to be further developed, right? And how does it further develop? Okay, so he was calling this 本本主义, okay, dogmatism, right? So he's promoting using armed practice as a way to promote pragmatism, right? And to add to this is Professor Jin Guantao's argument. Okay, actually, what this article did is to adding Confucianism to communism, what Jin Guantao calls as the Confucianization of Marxism and Leninism, right? So there are two main arguments. Okay, this is also from Jin Guantao's article. Okay, first part is about practice needs to produce knowledge. And in this part, he actually borrowed directly from the Confucian philosopher from the 16th century, Wang Yang, right? And for example, in this essay on practice, when Mao wrote about, when Mao wrote about how practice would produce knowledge, he said, quote, if you want to know the taste of a pear, you must change the pear by eating it yourself. Okay, this is what Wang Yang said, okay, in the 16th century. Wang Yang said, to know the bitterness of bitter melon, you must eat a bitter melon yourself. All right, so textually, you see it's very similar, okay, the way that Mao, but then there's no historical, there's no, direct, evidence showing that Mao referred to Wang Yang. Okay, so, but this sounds very similar. His first part of his argument sounds very much like Wang Yang's, dialectics, right, between practice and knowledge. But then the second part, okay, which is probably the more radical part, is that knowledge needs to serve practice while being tested and developed through practice. Okay, this borrows directly from Wang Chuanshan, he's a contemporary of Wang Yang, and on the right-hand side you see Wang Chuanshan. Okay, Wang Chuanshan is also from Hunan, where Mao grew up, right? And then there are direct evidence for Mao, okay, borrowing from Wang Chuanshan in developing his second main, more radical argument. Okay, first is Mao spent most of his 20s, okay, before the founding of the Chinese Communist Party. Mao was very heavily involved, okay, as basically when he was a college, okay, student, he was actively promoting Wang Chuanshan's philosophy. Okay, there's a study group called 传山学社, okay, where Mao spent the 7 years of his 20s, okay, in this 传山学社. He lives in this 传山学社even, all right? And so this is very well recorded. And then later on, okay, after the founding of the People's Republic, Mao actually also said, okay, and I'm quoting him saying, in the West, there's Hegel. Okay, in the East, there's Wang Chuanshan. Right, so that's the Hegel was before Marx, right? Hegelianism. Right, so Wang Chuanshan, this is how he sees Wang Chuanshan's influence, okay, on Chinese philosophy, okay, especially dialectic materialism. Okay, Wang Chuanshan is also a materialist, okay, philosopher. And then, most importantly, during July 1937, Mao actually wrote a letter to his former teacher in Hunan, because he wanted to refer to this in Wang Chuanshan's work, but he couldn't find it. This was only shortly after the Long March. Okay, material resources was very much insufficient. So he actually wrote to his former teacher, okay, Xu Teli, okay, in order to get a full copy of the 传山遗书, the full collection of Wang Chuanshan's essays, which is 288 volumes. All right, so Mao was indeed referring to this full set. All right, so why this is a radical departure from Stalinist, okay, Marxism, right? Is first, okay, he is introducing Confucianism, okay, through both arguments, okay, into the orthodox Stalinism at the time. And it's not only Confucian, but I would also argue, because this is Asian internet histories, okay, especially, okay, it's actually Asianization, or we can call it agrarianization of Marxism-Leninism. If people remember, some of you are familiar with Marxism. Marx is actually very famous to say there's something backward called Asian mode of production. all right? And in the early stage of the Soviet Union, okay, this Asian mode of production was also used by the Bolsheviks against the farmers who are backwards, okay, in Russia, who refuse to give up their grain for the modernization, okay, of the country, for example. But here, okay, so by Asianizing and agrarianizing, okay, this actually makes farmers, okay, and all the working population, okay, of Asia, and later on in Latin America, in Africa too, making them revolutionary subjects. And the third thing is Maoist praxis is, there are other kinds of Marxist praxis. Okay, Marx himself, okay, is practice his praxis from his journalism, right? And we also know in the 20th century there are Gramscian, okay, praxis about the organic intellectual and the hegemony theory, right? But Mao's praxis emphasizing the dialectics between knowing and doing, okay, is something distinct from both the Marxist and also Gramsci traditions. Applying this, okay, I need to probably fast forward a little bit, okay, to the computing history, right? So at the very bottom, okay, again, I'm citing this from On Practice, the essay, okay, and then, so these are the philosophical ideological foundations, and then these are the policy principles for computing industry development in the PRC. So let's look at the two foundations first, all right? And Mao wrote, again, let me quote from the essay On Practice, quote, "Human knowledge can in no way be separated from practice. The Marxist philosophy of dialectical materialism has two outstanding characteristics. One is its class nature. It openly avows that dialectical materialism is in the service of the proletariat. The other is practicality. Okay, it emphasizes the dependence of theory on practice, emphasizes that theory is based on practice and in turn serves practice. Okay, so Mao was very smart, okay, because he was debating the Stalinists. Okay, so he has to use this Marxist language while, putting into his own idea, which could never be found in, classic, okay, Marxist textbooks. Okay, I'm continuing to quote him. Okay, Mao again wrote, "Many theories of natural science are held to be true, not only because they were so considered when natural scientists originated them, but because they have been verified in subsequent scientific practice." Okay, and in this part, he was talking about all kinds of natural scientists, okay, breakthroughs, okay, in the early 20th century. And so it's very natural, okay, Mao's intended audience is not only, okay, our CNM students and the colleagues, but people in the natural hardcore sciences, including computer scientists as well, right? And then the okay, so this is from our historical material and that we collected, such as leading computer scientists from the Maoist era, from their memoirs. Okay, so it's 独立自主, 自力更生. Okay, if you're Chinese, you probably are very familiar with this, right? And it's applied not only to the computing industry, but all kinds of economic and the technology department, developments. But within the computing industry, they have its special meaning, right? And 独立自主, okay, it's the full literal translation for autonomy, actually means independence and autonomy, right? 自力更生, okay, the self-reliance, actually literal translation should be reproduce life using one's own capacity. Okay, you can renew and which means in a way, okay, indeed, okay, Chinese computing industry started from Soviet, okay, aid, right? But when they reproduce themselves, okay, then it's like children can outgrow their parents, right? Become better scholars, for example. Many of our students in this room probably will become better students than me in the future. So from here on, let me very quickly to show you some of the photographic, okay, historical archives that, because of the length limits, we could not include in the journal article. Okay, but you can find many of these easily online too. Right, on the left hand, this is the People's Daily article by Professor Min-Nai Da, okay, who returned from Germany. He got his PhD in computer science, okay, in Berlin, okay, in the 1930s. right? And then he returned. This is the first Chinese language article, 1955, about developing, okay, automated high-speed electronic computers, okay, in People's Daily. And then this was a very important meeting when Zhou Enlai was meeting. This Premier Zhou Enlai was the #2, okay, person for the new People's Republic, following only Chairman Mao, all right. And then he was meeting the top scientists. Several of them are computer scientists. And there on the right-hand side, this is China's first domestically made, computer, mainframe computer, DJS-1, also known as Type 103. Even though it's made in China, but the design and the critical technology all came from the Soviet Union, and the Russian experts, okay, were directly involved, right? But then this is only the open, okay, archive, okay. In China, like in most communist countries, there's an internal document, right? From the internal document, we could see that we learned that as early as 1951. The head of People's Liberation Army Communications Division. Okay, now you guys know Huawei. Okay, Huawei's founder Ren Zhengfei was a soldier. Okay, in the 1970s in the PLA Communications Division, right? And the PLA was already requesting to build China's first, electronics plan, and Zhou Enlai approved it on the 29th of August, 1951. So the internal, process actually long precedes, okay, this open document that you can see here on this slide. So the initial plan was based on Soviet scientific literature and Soviet aid investments, the technology, the money, the personnel, all right, in response to the pressing military needs of the Korean War. So this is why the Soviets were so generous, right? And during this early period of the 1950s, the Soviet Union actually transferred, okay, because of the Korean War, they transferred nearly 2,000 MiG fighter jets. This was the most modern fighter jets at the time, okay? And in order for fighter jets to communicate with each other, they need to use electronics device, right? And so more than nearly 2,000 the most modern fighter jets, okay, were transferred to China in 3 batches, as well as submarines, tanks, and radars. Okay, part of the deal was for China to take up the task for weapon maintenance and also manufacture of electronic parts for these modern arms. This first computer of China, by the way, still stands today. Okay, it stands now in Qufu, Shandong province. This is how it actually looked like. All right, and 103 was the original name of this first Soviet, okay, giant. But this 计算机, this handwriting is actually Jiang Zemin's handwriting. Okay, the post-Mao leader. So you can see how modern power is written, on top of Maoist, okay, post-Mao power, in a literal way. Now we fast forward into the 60s, which is a very exciting period. Okay, this is the decade. In 1964, China ignited its first nuclear test. Right. 1967 was when the first thermonuclear weapon test was carried out successfully. And then 1970, China had its first satellite. Okay, for all this, okay, it's called 两弹一星, the 2 bombs and 1 satellite. Okay, this high-tech program, they need to use computing power. Right, so the Type 107, you can see the name. 103 was basically a copycat of Russian technology, but the 107 was completely China's first, okay, indigenous designed general purpose computer, 1960. Very interestingly, okay, the chief scientist, Dr. Xia Peisu, is female. Okay, she is known as the mother of computer science in China. And when I look into the hidden histories, okay, of Chinese computing, there are actually a series of female, all right, scientists. So if you watch the Hollywood movie Hidden Figures, okay, in NASA, they try to hide the female, okay, involvement in the computing, okay, program. But in Maoist China, actually, it's very, it's not just Xia Peisu, but also the mother of semiconductor in China, material scientist, is Xie Xide, okay, another female who became later the first female university president in China, okay, which is Fudan University. right? And there's another very important computer scientist, Lin Lanyin, okay, who was a intellectual and also revolutionary, figure in Cultural Revolution. But because she was too Maoist, okay, the post-Mao was trying to wash her away, all right, whitewash her out from the computing history. So so you can see the computers, the early generation. This was a vacuum tube computer, okay, but this is already a more advanced transistor computer, right? Transistor based. And here you see the national math competition. The winners of national math competition, middle school, okay, students, okay, went to visit this computer in Beijing, all right. And then Marshal Nie Rongzhen, he is the PLA leader in charge of all these high-tech weaponry, strategic weaponry discussion, all right. So these are from the 60s. And then in the 60s, it's not only in Beijing, okay, in the PLA, headquarters, but also in Guizhou. Okay, this is China's first factory dedicated to the production of computers. Okay, so in Guizhou, okay, by per capita, income is actually the poorest province of China in southwest China, right next to Thailand and Myanmar, right? And then so this factory was built, okay, far away from Beijing and Shanghai, while Beijing, okay, this is the largest electronics tubes, okay, production facility. It's called Factory 774. When you see this 3-digit 774 means it's a military, okay, plant. Okay, it has more than 10,000 workers, and this assembly line is actually Asia's largest vacuum tube production line in the 1960s. Okay, and this photo was taken in 1991, but this Type 441, okay, mainframe computer was actually produced in 1970, okay, the year when China's, okay, first man-made satellite went to outer space, right? And so this is the elite, okay, these are the PLA elite, all right, military and also highly specialized. Okay, these people read the latest, okay, IEEE journals, all right, and the key leaders of these teams, like Professor Xia Peisu, we saw on the former slide, got their PhDs from MIT, UPenn, or University of Edinburgh or Berlin, right? So they were reading the latest global scientific literature at the same time, and they were not, in fact, impacted when the Cultural Revolution was causing havoc, okay, on other. They were protected, okay, to have their own, peer review, blind peer review, scientific peer review, for example, among themselves. So when the Stanford researcher Ivan Feigenbaum, okay, studied how the PLA elite weaponry scientists, how they are recognized, how they're organized, he actually found chimera is a strange combination made up of organizational cells from the Silicon Valley. Some of this scientific PLA, elite are organized like Silicon Valley, okay, model, because at the same time, these were people, who making decisions. They were trained in MIT, okay, in Stanford, right? But then you can also see Stalinist, okay, elements, and as well as Maoist mass line. Okay, mass line means to let the average people to join. So there's a very strange chimera. Okay, but at the very center is actually something similar to Silicon Valley today. This is according to Feigenbaum, right? But then my critique and Hongzhe, together we are not satisfied with Evan Feigenbaum's ethic approach, because he failed to understand. It's very easy for him coming from the Silicon Valley to see something similar to Silicon Valley, but in so doing, he failed to understand, that this very odd, okay, that almost like a chimera kind of combination has an inner logic in the context of uncertainties due to the external volatility, and more crucially, the contending domestic forces within China's computing industry, spreading from the military to the civilian, from different parts of the world, right? And the 60s was the era when China and the Soviet relationship went really bad, right? And they had a conflicts in words, okay, propaganda conflicts, and later on they were actually armed conflicts, okay, in 1969, right, and Soviet actually threatened to use a nuclear weapon against China at during this time. Now so these were the conditions when the scientists were developed and why they enjoy the privilege, because if they don't develop this advanced computing technology, then China could not catch up with the Soviets in the 60s, okay, facing existential threats from Moscow. Now we go into the 70s. Now we have more rich materials from not only China, but from the US, from Canada. Okay, 1972, the first American delegation. So you see here, the Americans are here. Okay, the 6 computer scientists went to China, and this is open. You can go to the online archive of Stanford University and read the whole report. All right, and then this is when they were discussing. Okay, and what's really fascinating them they couldn't find out is that they saw this kind of production lines in Shanghai. Okay, and this factory is called a window handle factory. This factory used to be making handles for window, okay, low-tech stuff, okay? But then the workers are there to making computers, they're putting, computer parts onto printed circuit boards, right? So this is so-called the Shanghai model. Before they arrived, between 1968 and 1971, China had the so-called electronic Great Leap Forward, right? And started by Mao's secretary, Chen Boda. Okay, actually, Hongzhe's Chinese article analyzing Chen Boda in this period won an award, right? And Deng Xiaoping actually played a negative role, trying to argue against Chen Boda, argue against the electronic Great Leap Forward. What is electronic Great Leap Forward? Is that it's not only those people with PhDs coming back from US or the UK or Europe. Okay, it's not only the PLA, the military, okay, the protected, right, elite within the PLA, but the average, okay, middle-aged housewives, okay, or even in some cases old uncles and aunties, okay, we would call them in Singapore. They don't understand ABC, but they can make computers, and these computers are not just for fun. They use this in their actual production in textile, for example, cardigan, okay, protection. Okay, and this is the so-called Shanghai model for computer development, right? And this Shanghai model has to be understood as part and parcel of the class politics. Remember, Mao emphasizing on practice the class nature, okay, during the Cultural Revolution, when organizational efforts at both local and central levels were coordinated to demystify electronics and computing. So, some colleagues in our department study literacy, okay, computer science literacy. This was about literacy, okay, not only so that people know about computer science, but people do computer science, okay, in their everyday production, okay, process. Okay, as pointed out, okay, by one of the publications from Shanghai wool welter factory. This is like cardigan. They make cardigan, garments, for example, right? Those who preach that only genius can know. Okay, I actually have that in the next slide. All right, probably I will. So these are some other documents. Oh, by the way, this is China's first desktop computer, 1973, made in Shaoguan, all right, Guangdong province, and it's called Nanhua. It's the same like in Singapore's Nanhua School. It's exactly the same 2 Chinese characters, all right? Okay, so I'm quoting here, okay, from the archives, okay, from a worker who said, okay, this worker works in a garment factory, okay? Those who preach that only genius can know electronics, that technology is mysterious, ultimately want to lead to one conclusion: we should be ruled by the noble and the wise. Workers say instead, all productive technologies are summations of practices in actual production experiences. Okay. So this crystallization of Shanghai model is the so-called barefoot electricians, 赤脚包工. Okay, it's like in Mao's era, they have barefoot doctors. Okay, so these are the people who go around and fix computers, okay, low-end computers when they were used in textile manufacture, for example, right? And this would include female turners in small wool sweater factories, and these are usually like they're called collectively owned. They're not state-owned factories. They're not military, right? Very small and in the neighborhood. Okay, and they were able to apply low-end computing technology to automate garment production lines. Okay, these are the actual figures. Okay, we got from the archives. By the end of 1973, all of 1,500 looms in the 14 wool factories in Shanghai were semi-automated, resulting in a 52% increase of productivity compared to 1966. Meanwhile, between 1966 and 1973, no new loom was added. More types of sweaters were made, while the total number of workers decreased. A clear indication that the application of computing technology could enhance economic productivity without alienating labor. If members of the working class were also the owners, managers, designers, and operators of computing devices. Fastening forward, 1970s, this is late 1970s, this is after 1978, okay? Usually seen as the watershed moment for the end of Maoism, but we see the continuation of Maoism after 1978, right? So in some ways, the Maoist radical practices was not only continued, but also culminated, okay, in the 1970s, right? So these were the popular magazine at the time, okay, called Electronic World, and they were showing, okay, young people, right, like they were making their, they were attaching their computing devices to telephone, okay, or television at the time, okay. Some of these were developed for military use, but most of them are for civilian use, right? And then this was used for, these are the mainframe computers, by exactly the same group of, so after 1978, there was no change of guards for the elite PLA, okay, satellites, okay, communication unit. It's the same, exactly the same group of people who carried on. So there's a continuation in that sense, right? And then this was Dongfang Hong too. If you know Chinese, Dongfang Hong means east is red. Okay, this is actually a salute to Chairman Mao. Okay, this is the second, okay, Dongfang Hong satellite. And when it went up, this was a supercomputer. Okay, DJS 320. Okay. And on top, you will see those were actually a Maoist quotation written, okay, on top of the supercomputer used for satellite launch in 1984, right? So the inaugural, and at the same time, so you can see both lines were continuing, all right, on the elite line and also the mass line for children, okay, especially when they have this competition, that this CASTC, this science and technology, okay, contest continue to this day. And in the makeup, they try very hard to include working class kids, including ethnic minority kids, okay, not only the elite kids. Okay, so that's the tradition. Okay, now we have finished a very quick look at the old photos, right? And if we look at the timeline, indeed, China's computing industry had Soviet roots when they were using vacuum tubes. But from the time when they were using transistors and also IC, okay, integrated circuits, it's very much a domestic, right, indigenous technology. The first IC in the world, of course, was made in the US, I think 1965, okay? And China made its first IC in 1968. And it's the same year Soviet Union made its first IC. All right, so China actually caught up, even though China was a student of Soviet Union in vacuum tube computers. But when it comes to IC, okay, based computer, China was actually, have already caught up by this point, okay? And afterwards is the electronic Great Leap Forward, right? And later on, this is when there were hyper larger scale, going alongside, okay, the mass line at the same time, that leading to the transition into the neoliberal turn, okay, or post-socialist turn, when China discarded, okay, it's not just computing, okay. China used to have a domestic large aircraft, okay, industry, and then they scrapped it to buy American, okay, Boeing's, you know, airplanes. Okay, so it's a similar story. So why this? We see this timeline. I probably need to be very quick now, right? So on the one hand, this timeline, and when we see major changes, okay, either escalating or changing direction from a elite oriented to a mass line, or to balance the two, actually these were punctuated by security threats to China, perceived, you know, either from the US, like Korean War, or Soviet, you know, Sino-Soviet conflict, okay, in 1969, right? And the same thing, even though we did not go on to analyze, okay, Tiananmen, okay, and the Western sanctions against China, and even the U.S.-China trade war, but it's you know, actually the domestic trajectory actually responds to the international, okay, vicissitudes of geopolitics, as well as internal crisis. Tiananmen is an internal crisis, right? And also the internal, not only to the country, but also within the Communist Party of China. And beyond Soviet American influence is that it's not only you know, the Soviet and US, all these other countries, okay, like the UK in 1961, okay, China actually sent a delegation, you know, from its Electronics Association, okay, All China Electronics Association sent its delegation to the UK to investigate the application of semiconductors in computing in 1961. Okay. And then, of course, if you know the beginning of internet in China, the first email, okay, sent from China actually went to Karlsruhe University in West Germany, right? So Germany is here. We see in the documents that China also imported entire production line, you know, computer production line from France. Most interestingly, most important is we need to look at Japan. The Sino-Japanese exchange in computing actually is two-way. It's not only China learning from Japanese. In 1957, because this is very important because Japan used Chinese characters, Chinese too, okay? And then they try to, you know, how can computers read and write and display Chinese characters? Okay, the Japanese was wrestling with this question, so did the Chinese. 1957, Chinese article was translated into Japanese and published in the Japanese journal about how to, you know, make Chinese characters in computers, right? It was more of a theoretical piece. And 1963, there's a long queue. We see the document in Beijing. There's a long queue for people waiting to see Japanese semiconductor show. Okay, 1963, 65, Japan started to export a semiconductor production line to China. Okay, at the beginning of the Cultural Revolution, 1973, Xinhua News Agency sent a delegation to Japan to learn about their Hongzhe production processing system so that they can use it in their journalism. 1974, exhibition of Chinese character, okay, information system in Beijing, like this one, Fujitsu, okay, JEC, okay, JEF, okay. And this was in the early 70s, Japan had a so-called Hongzhe information processing fever after the World Expo held in Osaka in 1970. So many of these machines were officially and sometimes smuggled, okay, from Japan into China. And on the bottom here, you see this was a Chinese, this was a machine displaying a Maoist slogan. I'm not going to read, okay, but this is a picture taken by the American delegation. Okay, so they were working on Chinese language processing, you know, while having an exchange with their Japanese colleagues. For those of us who are interested in critical communication, political economy studies, you probably know the Canadian, you know, scholar Dallas Smythe. Right? Dallas Smythe also went to China after the American delegation. And by the way, China and the US had no diplomatic relationship. So when the 6 American scientists went to China, they had to apply for a visa to visit China through the Chinese embassy in Canada, all right, in Ottawa. So Dallas Smythe, he is openly, recognized himself as a Maoist. So he wrote this article called the After Bicycle What, right? And he actually, argued, okay, in this article. This is one of the most legendary article in the history of the critical political economy of communication, right? Smythe contended that the policies for socialist communication technology need to be more radical, alternative, and freed from capitalist constraints. That socialism needs its own development criteria, which should differ fundamentally from capitalist yardsticks of individualism, consumerism, and planned obsolescence. Visiting China following the electronic Great Leap Forward, Smythe proposed that the PRC should not adopt Western-style one-way TV. Instead, it should develop its own two-way TV or electronic 大字报. That's how Smythe calls it. But when Hongzhe and I look at it, it's actually read like a YouTube system, okay, two-way, right? And so that they can ensure horizontal and interactive communication at the grassroots, okay, to meet the collective needs of workers, farmers, and soldiers. So this article was written by Smythe as a letter to the vice president of the Chinese Communist Party, okay? But he never received any reply, and this history was forgotten. But Hongzhe was actually, very persistent. He translated the English article, very well known in Western, okay, neo-Marxist, okay, circles, okay. But the Chinese keep forgetting it. So Hongzhe translated this article into English, into Chinese, and we had it published in a journal in China in, almost 40 years after the original English, article. So I'm getting towards the end of my sharing. Okay, so here we are conceiving, okay, Mao's dialectical materialism between knowing and doing, okay, as a process contingent upon praxis, okay, in a dynamic real world context, okay. And this kind of understanding suggests, okay, there's a profound distrust, okay, by Mao against established structures of power, okay, could be Stalinism, could be other, right? And also the dogmatic thinking about preordained development paths, including in computing. That's how the computer scientists, okay, interpret and apply, okay, Maoist praxis in their work. The indeterminacy, okay, stems in part from what Castells calls counterpower, by which he understands the capacity by social actors to challenge and eventually change the power relations institutionalized in society. Castells continues without making explicit reference to Mao, but I could read Mao, okay, from between the lines. Okay, I'm quoting Castells from his 2007 book, Communication Power. Okay, quote, in known societies, in known societies, counterpower exists under different forms and with variable intensity as one of the few natural laws of society, verified throughout history, asserts that wherever is domination, there is resistance to domination, be it political, cultural, economic, psychological, or otherwise, opposed to what they often define as global capitalism. So if we talk about global capitalism, then Maoist praxis was a counterpower, right? And against US and also USSR even. Okay, so this is CCP's revolutionary, anti-imperialist and anti-capitalist roots, took shape as response to American and Soviet, hegemony. But then when we zoom within from a global level to, within China, okay, within the PRC, then the CCP, you don't need me to tell you, right? The CCP often turns into the dominant power, okay, facing the counterpower and the challenges of the various classes, interest groups, including scientists with different kind of social, technological visions. So this is one of my last slides. Okay, so there's the elite line about the strategic weaponry development around 2 bombs and 1 satellite. Okay. And then there's the grassroots line. Okay, it was ignited by Mao's directly by Chen Boda, Mao's secretary. Right, and Mao probably have indirect inputs for this Shanghai model. Right, And then rather than the traditional elitist, when the ethic, scholars only look at the state on the PLA, Silicon Valley model, but then there's actually equally important, and maybe for us, is more important is the mass line approach that are collectively owned. So these are like co-ops, and then they are maximizing indigenous capacity, right? And so despite efforts, but I forgot to mention this 7301 conference, this is how we started the article, is trying to resolve the tension between the top-down and the elitist and the grassroots, right? But then after, the post-Mao transformation, there are lots of obfuscation, trying to forget, especially the lower part, the grassroots part, right? But then the confrontation between the classes has actually continued to define the undetermined, trajectory of Chinese computing and internet industries. The antagonism between the information have less. These are migrant workers, retirees, peasants, and also the upper class interest groups. This is a defining feature of China's network society in the 2000s, as I wrote in my 2009 book. So this has continued today through social media on the picket line by ordinary workers in the manufacturing sector, and also moved to the very heart of high-tech computing industry, such as the 996 ICU movement by computer programmers in spring 2019 that had prompted responses from China's official trade union, as well as tech tycoons such as Jack Ma. If you are following the news yesterday, now even within Alibaba, they're starting unions now. All right, so the informal practice the struggles being fought out on social media and even in GitHub is now becoming institutionalized. If we know this longer history, of the class antagonism, then it won't strike as a surprise to see unionization within Alibaba yesterday, right? So and then the point, at least the CASTC, this contest, among adolescents, computer enthusiasts, from its origins in the 1970s onwards, is to show that although mainstream historical narratives of China's high-tech sector have largely left Maoist legacies in oblivion, the dialectical materialism from on-practice remains relevant for the imagination of alternative digital futures. The process is anything but preordained, dependent on foreign imports. While the path of autonomy and self-reliance remains a key rhetoric and cultural repertoire, the actual process of technology development is one characterized by precarious mediation, as Liu Xiao argued in her 2019 book, Connecting China's Socialist Past Through the Magic Waves of Radical Praxis to Futuristic Imaginations, full of promises, paradoxes, and possibilities. So to conclude, what is Maoist radical practices in the computing sector is about autonomy and self-reliance. This is our attempt to reconstruct emic and also historical approach, recognizing the Confucian roots of Maoism, as reflected in this one essay, and to emphasize the underdetermined pathways, the multilateral in a relationship, not only with the US and the Soviets, but also Japan, right, Canada, sometimes in both ways, right? And then the social class relations, right? No matter external or internal, they are crystallized as crises, right? And this is much better to understand. I would argue even today's Chinese computing industry development trajectory through the lens of crisis, rather than Beijing's rhetoric, or Washington DC's, right? So the ultimate goal, so this is my conclusion here is that the metaphorically speaking, this is knowing and doing is the yin and the yang of radical praxis in Chinese history of computing. The knowing and the doing, power and counterpower, past and futures. These are not only antithetical to each other, they also necessitate, reproduce, co-create, and strengthen each other. So this is Mao's dialectical materialism as articulated on Praxis, a productive theoretical framework for us to make sense of China's computing history with its long indigenous roots under determined trajectories and imaginary futures. So these futures in the plural is really, really important. So for today, we should see, so this is Professor Lu Feng, okay, when he was analyzing Beijing Electronic Tubes Factory, right? He's from the business school, right? So this is excellent organizational history of that factory, right? And now becoming one of the world's largest computer monitor display manufacturer. Okay, so in order to understand this company, we need to understand its organizational gene in Maoist radical praxis. And then more broadly beyond China, I'd like to invite, okay, my colleagues, studying Southeast Asia, for example, we need to excavate indigenous Asian theories for CNM, communications and new media research. And this radical practice is only a beginning, all right? We can probably excavate many other Asian communication theories that can be applied and becoming useful from an emic standpoint today. But I want to also end with a caution against cultural essentialism, all right? Like to celebrate Maoism or Confucianism, or Marxism, all right? This is actually against, okay, this kind of uncritical romanticizing of Maoism is actually against the radical praxis itself, all right? I just like to end here, and thank you, and sorry for running a bit over time.
Thanks, Jack. Thanks for this great talk. I think I echo everyone to say that we have really learned a lot. There was so much here. So if you have questions, please feel free to either type it down on chat or we just raise your hands. But I thought I would just start off with a couple of observations and maybe a question for you, Jack. So first of all, again, thanks for this so much for this talk. I was already impressed with this with your article. I was just marking down every line. I was like, oh, okay, I'm marking down too much of the article. This marks don't make sense anymore. Then I heard your talk, and it's just even more fantastic, right? The ways you provide, I think, a de-Westernized yet globally and historically concrete revisionist history of computing is so impressive. Not easy to do, but really sort of very solid here. And the way you're then critically pulling out what you call radical praxis, right? The Maoist radical praxis displays again this historical connection that we as critical scholars, as thinkers on media in this room, really want to see and really want to pursue, right? As a guiding sort of guiding factor. We also have a student, Changwen, I think he's also in the room, right? And so hearing your talk really, I think, cemented like his work. I'm really excited to see what Changwen studies and works on as he pursues his work on Maoism. But so I have a couple of questions for you, Jack. And as you're talking through your talk, I saw so many connections, so many ideas. Even when you're talking about, giving Mao's example of the pear and the bitter melon, right? And then the pear, about how the pear tastes. I was like, that's classic affect theory, right? So I was like, how does that reply, But the one thing that struck me was because there was a lot of emphasis on grassroots factory production, right? And the turn to an emic perspective. I wonder, I hope you maybe can elaborate a little bit about the complexities of labor movements that you were observing in that period of time. So, the pictures that I saw that there was, I think, one picture of someone doing computing on those early computers, right? So there was a woman, right? And later on at the making of the transistor chips, again, I see primarily women of the gendered workforce there. So I'm kind of wondering, yes, so I think that there is this class element right here. How does, say, elements about gender of ethnicity, right, feature in this sort of the politics that you are trying to draw here, this radical praxis, right? How does gender feature? Maybe even how does age feature, right? Because you spoke a lot about adolescence, right? And the hope for adolescents, to grow up to be better than their mentors and their parents. So how does that feature into that history? And a separate question that I had for you sort of was to think about more about your recent work, right? Because I mean, you're speaking about radical praxis. You're speaking about the possibility of imaginative futures. And I know you're also working on platform co-ops, right? And you have been thinking a little bit about blockchains, right? How do those new forms of technology or new forms of organization, you think, relate or not relate to sort of this emphasis on doing as knowing kind of praxis, right? That you are sort of elaborating with here. So yeah, these two questions maybe to open up this talk, and then we can take on more questions later.
All right, thanks, Renyi. To your second question, I want to thank you very much because I've never thought about it. Okay, it's a new question I have to work on. So I don't have any answer to your second question, but it's a brilliant question that I will pursue. Maybe we can pursue this together, right? And but for your first question, the complexity of labor movement in Mao's China. Okay, I think I know some answers to it. Okay, I think when it comes to, especially, it's not just the masculine labor. Okay, we know, including China, but most part of the world, the labor movement suffers from too much masculinity when you are a revolutionary party, right? So when Mao, actually, this is actually quite similar. If we read again Pang Laiguan, okay, her work on Maoism and the representations of gendered, especially barefoot doctors, right? And I think there's a propaganda effort, okay, to play up, okay, women, okay, as the leader. Okay, it's not just men can be doctors or, okay, computer specialists, but women also can. So there's definitely a propaganda. Okay, so that is a media representation part. But when we also a center of that grassroots factory production is indeed the Shanghai model, right? So there are actually, evidence showing that it's not, even though I have to have these qualifications, that there's for propaganda purpose, they play up, okay, even ethnic and also children, okay, age, differentiation. But then there are also evidence here. So I think the best well-known model worker from the Shanghai model, her name is Wang Qiangmei, all right? And so there are actually, she did oral history documentary about her life, all right? And so there is much better. And of course, I also know some of my senior colleagues worked in factories during Maoist time, okay? So it's not perfect. Okay, there are still within the everyday factory work life, there is still male dominance. Okay, against the female. Okay, in different kind of forms, right? And of course, Maoist feminism also has its own known as the Iron Lady. Okay, rhetoric. They still use male body as the yardstick to measure female, okay, workers, okay, productivity, and celebrate if the female can be as productive or even more productive than men. But so you can see here, men is still used as the yardstick. Okay, but then when we going back to the opportunity, okay, being offered, okay, and so my short answer to your question, okay, it's not perfect. The Maoist labor movements in these grassroots factories are not perfect, but they're much better than today's computer industry, IT industry, no matter in China or in other parts of the world. Okay? But I still don't know enough. Okay, and again, we need to separate. Okay, I think just for the elite, like the PLA, the chief scientist for China's first indigenous, okay, mainframe computer, okay, and I mentioned there are at least two other. This will deserve a separate analysis. Okay, I think and all three of them, okay, got so one got PhD from MIT, second is the first female PhD from UPenn, the third from Edinburgh, right? And then how their life paths intertwined in the computer industry, and they are indeed, they were leader of the technological development team. But then above them, they are administrative. Okay, those are still men, especially Marshal Nie Rongzhen, right? Who is like a vice president of China, right? And then so they are, yes, they are in charge of technology team, but then they are still working in a patriarchal system. Okay, so I think that deserves a separate analysis. But yeah, that's my partial answer to your first question. Thank you.
Thanks, Jack. So Alex has a question for you. Alex, please.
Hey, Jack. So my question is to do with how the Cultural Revolution influenced this computing history, and to ask you to talk about that in more depth. And I'll prefigure it with a comment, because as you know, On Practice for me is a key text. What's important for me is the two poles between On Practice and the Cultural Revolution, right? And in what's striking about On Practice is it mentions thought and practice, or theory and practice, in circular ways, and dialectic, but not the word contradiction. But I don't know if I'm actually being etic by bringing in contradiction, because some of his other Yan'an writings do have that word contradiction. So if that's him appealing to the Stalinists, I don't know. But there is a contradiction, it seems, that lies latent until the Cultural Revolution. In On Practice, he talks about the revolutionary people, the workers, etc., and the party, right? Now, in the 60s, he's answering the question, where are the bourgeoisie? He's saying right in the heart of the Communist Party, right? And this is spreading like wildfire, to the point where by 66, you do have proto-Red Guards, at universities starting to try and create something new and being quite vociferous. And he leaves Beijing, I think. Then he comes back, and then in 66, he has the decision on the 16 points, right? Which is, we must let this revolutionary activity play out. But what happens? We have factionalism, we have cadres, we have incredible violence, civil war breaks out, and then Mao eventually has to capitulate to the party. So the party comes back in, military rule comes back in a hardcore way. And then by the 9th conference I think the 9th conference was 68 or 69, it's basically reinforcing the status of the party as the ultimate authority. So autonomy and self-reliance, right? It seems to me that contradicts the party. And Mao's, the Marxist term for a contradiction is, of course, the real point at which thought and practice meet its limit, right? Not as two different points, but as one. And something must happen, what Hegel would call Aufhebung, right? The sublation, which is to cast aside, retain, and rise up. And for me, the Cultural Revolution is where that contradiction between autonomy and self-reliance and the party could not Aufhebung. So that's why they're two classic poles, right? So if the computing history is all about autonomy and self-reliance, what is the relationship between the communist revolution and the computing history? Because to me, that seems key.
All right, thanks for a very deep Marxist and dialectical question. First, let me give you a simple answer to you, is that my understanding, we did not write this down, we should have, okay. I think there's a direct relationship between the Cultural Revolution starting in 1966, okay, and the electronic Great Leap Forward in 1968, 2 years later, right? And again, Hongzhe has his award-winning Chinese article, okay, I hope we can translate it into English, okay, is focusing on, the debate within the Communist Party about whether they should start a electronic Great Leap Forward, because their previous experience with the agriculture industrial Great Leap Forward was not exactly, perfect, right? So there were internal, debates, and but then the reason, Chen Boda is the secretary of Mao Zedong who started electronic Great Leap Forward, so there's a direct a relationship between the beginning of the Cultural Revolution and the electronic Great Leap Forward, right? But then your other question, so this is my understanding, right? I don't know whether I think he will agree with me, all right?
That's ironic to me, by the way. That's ironic that the electronic Great Leap starts with the Cultural Revolution,
after,
right?
Yes,
or after the Cultural Revolution. Yes. I see the irony there.
Because in the 1960s, it's also because I'm sure Mao knows how much money they're spending on the 2 bombs and 1 satellite, and they're giving, when the American, political scientists went to China in 1972, the first thing the Chinese computer science is telling them is like, don't tell us what you have already published in, ACM, the IEEE journals. We read every one of them. Tell us the stuff you have not published, right? So it's like they spend lots of money on the elite weaponry development. So I think Mao also was not satisfied with that. He diverged. He let Chen Boda start it so that more resources can be diverted away from the elite, supercomputer development to the grassroots, which is inconsistent with his, And then your other question is, this is why we focus on it. We are not applying Maoism as a whole to computer industry. Usually when Maoist philosophy, there are 2 foundations. One is on practice, written 1937. The other one is called on contradiction, 1942, right? And which is a very different, it's talking about like it's more like a Hegelian, It's like we talk about it as it's like the division of the unity and the unity of the binary. So that's and when Mao was writing that, in a way, this is my own reading, but you probably can disagree with me. I think on practice is more radical, than on contradiction, right? And when Mao was
I agree.
Yes, then we're on the same page. So the on contradiction is when he write about it, he was already comfortable in his position. So if you read the Chinese version, I don't know whether you get it from the English version, when Mao was writing on practice, his Chinese writing is he was very careful to not to make something wrong, all right? So that he will still appease the Stalinists while, stealing in the Confucianism, while the Confucianists also would not completely disagree, So his writing is one of his most conservative writing style. But the thoughts of like we need to have a new kind of we need to use practice to redevelop knowledge. That's something very path breaking. So I think maybe it will be interesting to we can work together to see how.
I think you actually need both texts in a way and their contradiction with each other, but that's so interesting that, well, A, Mao tried to divert these resources to less elite places, but also B, that at the end of the Cultural Revolution, the electronic revolution begins, which to me is ironic. Thanks so much, Jack.
Sorry to let you wait, Lance. If you have your hand up, who cannot hear you?
Yeah, Lance, we can't hear you, Lance.
Why don't you write in
okay,
chat?
we can move on first. Almi actually has a question. He says, thanks, Jack, for the interesting talk. How can you see this practice reflected in different Asian societies, particularly Southeast Asian societies? And I'm sorry because we are running a little bit short on time at this point, so this will be the last question. But we could ask questions privately to Jack later. So Jack, back to you.
All right, I don't know enough. I think my work is only to test the possibility and also to pave the way for more indigenous. So that we can use. I don't know enough about, for example, Malaysia. But I think in Indonesia, the Bandung moment, the Bandung conference, where it's actually also Sukarno's work. And if I was in Sukarno, the Bandung conference, Asia Africa conference, the site 3 years ago, right? And actually, lots of the exhibition there are about journalism and the new media at the time, okay, like broadcasting technologies at the time. So I think that my suspicion is that okay, Sukarno's thoughts, okay, and also maybe other, okay, there are justification. I also know there are also important feminists, okay. We call it what Raymond Connell calls Southern theory, right? Like Indonesia also have, okay, and of course India, okay. And so I don't know enough, but I think I really would love to learn from everyone, you know, here, knowing more about. Like, on the one hand, there are intellectual resources, okay, in other Asian countries, and on the other hand, there are, okay, experiment. It does not have to be computing, okay, but could be anything related to media and communication, okay, because every country, you know, post-colonial, okay, time have to use media and new media for nation building, right? So I think that's when there's an institutionalized, okay, practice, and when the political leader or the cultural, okay, leaders are developing ways to explain the post-colonial experience. I think that's a similar enterprise that I don't know exactly where, but we can try. Yeah, it will be very worthwhile for us to try, especially given that we are in Singapore.
Right. So in the interest of time, we will end here. But I do see other questions here, so maybe we could just reach out to Jack privately. So anyway, I want to thank everyone for being here at our research talk. Please come again next week at the same time. All right. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Just
Thanks,
just one thing. Yeah. Next week, we don't have a talk. Next week, we don't have a talk. We have a talk the week after that, right?
Okay.
All right.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Thank you. Yeah. Mai Tai, I saw your good question, but that's a question we have to discuss in secrecy. Okay. Bye.